the compound, only once an hour on what was called a controlled move, announced by Control, which was the nerve center of the compound. I never got used to the many changing, very confusing federal rules. And I had an eye over my shoulder all the time. I learned over the years to make my classroom a kind of sanctuary with soft music to greet my students, colorful posters, and fresh flowers whenever I could. Never did my students fail to comment on the flowers. Our high school program was voluntary, but federal rules dictated that every man had to either have a GED or a high school diploma or spend 9 months in school making a sincere effort to pass the test. Many of the men who we initially enrolled and tested in our program were far below an 8th grade proficiency level, badly needing our remedial classes in reading, writing, and basic math. They were eager to be in school, and they were also nervous and scared after a long time away. When asked what decision they made that they most regretted, I heard many of them say it was not their crime that bothered them the most, but the fact that they dropped out of high school. I heard this over and over. If only I'd stayed in school, I would have had a job and I wouldn't be here. I did not have a captive audience ever. For the institution, school always came first. School never came first, I'm sorry. Men would get caught outside between moves. They were on call out, the computerized list of places they needed to be that were different from their regular programs or job assignments. They got sick, they overslept. Sometimes they could not leave work. They went back to court, being called being out on writ. They had appointments with doctors, dentists, and were taken out to local hospitals. They had visits from their families. When they broke the rules, which they did, they were put in the hole, the segregated unit with individual cells where they were confined all day for weeks, sometimes months at a time. From the very first night, my students treated me with such respect and kindness that it never once occurred to me to be afraid of any one of them. I always knew that if I'd been threatened in any way, other men would quickly protect me. I heard rumblings of occasional fights that went on in the housing units or other places around the compound, but the men protected us from knowing any details about any violence. The diversity in my classroom was stunning. People from all over the world, students of all ages, cultural backgrounds, and economic circumstances. I had all kinds of students in all kinds of academic and maturity levels. A few were very difficult, but most of the men I knew were hardworking and expressed their gratitude over and over. I spent most of my years teaching English, civics, and U.S. history, but in my early years, I taught ABE, or Adult Basic Education, a test-based program of basic skills, and had to share a classroom with a federal GED class in an isolated back corner of the factory on the compound. On many days, as I stood with 50 or 60 men waiting in the rain or the snow for someone to unlock the factory door, I would think to myself, where am I? How did I get here? So many of the men I knew astonished me. T-Bone arrived in this classroom one October morning, bringing in his own brand of sunshine. He was African American, stockily built, in his late 50s or early 60s, always wearing a blue knit cap that sat on the front of his forehead. From the very first day, he approached the teacher on the other side of the room, who almost never interacted with any of us, grabbed his hat in his fist, took a little bow, and said, "Good morning, sir. How are you? I hope you're having a great day." He encountered me on that first day like I was a member of a royal family. "Oh, my, you and I are going to have such a great time in here. I can write my name, I can write T-Bone, and I can read the word stop, but that's all." No wonder he was in jail. "You and I are going to have a wonderful time in here. He settled right down to work, and several of his classmates volunteered to help him. In fact, it was a problem that he was so fun to work with that I had trouble getting everybody else to do their own work. Wanting to get to know him, I asked if he'd like to tell me a short story, and I would write it down. Then we could read it together. Well, of course, he said. You need to have one of my famous recipes. He answered with the title, Mr. T-Bone's world-famous barbecue sauce, not to be fed to children under 10. Then came a long list of ingredients, some repeated for a yield large enough to feed about 50 or 60 people. Everything we did delighted him. Every day, he arrived in a sunny mood. Every single day, he greeted the teacher on the other side of the room in the same way. One of his classmates asked him one day, T-Bone, why are you so nice to him? He never even answers you. T-Bone replied, because I'm not going to let no other man tell me what kind of person I'm going to be. On the last day, before Christmas break, I brought in some colored paper for paper chains. All of the men would have made them long enough to stretch around the fence. They were so delighted with them. Just before lunch was called, T-Bone called me over and said quietly, I made you a little something and I put it in your bag, but you need to pick it up, walk right on out of here, and don't look in the sack till you get home, and don't be wearing it in here again either. The warden has one just like it, only his is green. When I got home, I found an orange and white striped hat with a large orange tassel that he'd made for me for Christmas. He had crocheted it himself. Teaching T-Bone was like driving a luxury car, but I would face many steep hills to climb, knowing nothing about a group of students whose background and lives were diametrically opposed to my comfortable, advantaged, middle-class background. It would be years before I knew what and how to teach them. Thankfully, one of my lessons happened early. Delighted to get a green light to teach a humanities class, I spent the summer creating lessons I hoped would be engaging and fun. I had a great group, all waiting outside my door when I got there, except for one man. Mr. Hawks walked in and headed to the far corner of the room, mumbling to people around when a new lesson was introduced. He said little for weeks, doing his assignments, but continuing to sulk. As the weeks went on, he began to rattle me. One night, as I introduced a new topic, he raised his hand and asked in an impatient voice, Mrs. Wenzel, where's all the black stuff? All we're doing in here is white stuff. Don't you like what black people have done? I felt like I'd been punched. Stumbling through to the end of the class, I drove home feeling confused, upset, and filled with questions about where to go from there. I was thinking, where did I think I was? I was looking out at my students, and almost all of them were people of color. All I could think about was my carefully crafted lessons for the whole semester and my heavy schedule. Bigger than that was the fact that I didn't know much of anything about black music, art, or literature, had never had a class in it, had no materials, and certainly no confidence. I felt overwhelmed and dreaded the next class. Fortunately, I had a weekend to think it over, and I decided to be honest with them, apologize, and ask for their help. They cooperated as I did the best I could, and we finished the semester. Now I see it far more clearly. I had a tendency as a white person to feel like my history and culture was normal, therefore most important. But I now knew where I was, and that I needed to totally change my focus. I had to pull myself out of my white-centered reality and get in a different direction. This was in the 1980s, and when I looked carefully at textbooks, there was nothing in any literature text written by anyone who wasn't white. And my students pointed out that any information about their people in history textbooks was almost always in the margins or boxed in. They already felt marginalized and boxed in. It would take many more mistakes to get it right, but I knew what a favor Mr. Hawks had done for me. As the years went on and available materials reflected more diversity, I found fascinating people and stories about African, Native, and Hispanic Americans to include in all of my classes. I heard so many men say, if I'd had this kind of stuff in high school, I might not have dropped out. I got shocked, even in my last weeks, by what they did not know. But I learned to challenge them with the material and check in a lot. Calls for lunch came anytime between 11 and 11:30, so often they had their jackets on and were ready to rush out the door as soon as they heard the loudspeaker click on. I needed fillers, so I would ask them, especially on Fridays, to write down a question or something important that they'd learned in history that week. This is what I got. Who's George Washington? From a new student in the program. And from another, I didn't know you couldn't ride a horse to England. My favorites, after a quick overview of some European history before the Europeans arrived in North America, were these. Columbus is no hero in my book. I think he was a low-budget explorer and got lost, wrote one. Mr. Houck wrote, the Black Death sure was no joke. The disease was carried by fleas on the rats that came from Asia. They killed millions of people. It is amazing to me that fleas could do that. I was shocked, and I ain't never gonna mess with no rats. My friend Mr. C had a 33-year sentence for a drug crime. He was with me as a student for 4 years, then as my classroom aide for another 17. He did his time like a monk, creating reflective time every week. Without his clarity, his kindness, his wisdom, and his very consistent calm, I could not have taught in the way I learned to teach. I cannot imagine my time in prison without him. He got out early in just 22 years and just finished building a community center back in his hometown of Kingston, Jamaica. There were those men who seemed like they would continue criminal behavior no matter what happened, but I met only a few with that kind of attitude, and there were a few who seemed totally innocent. Mr. Day sat in the front, wide-eyed with wonder, back in school after 25 years. He said, I have to pinch myself that this is real. Man, oh man, I cannot believe it. Every assignment was done perfectly and on time in a beautiful manuscript. In a year when we were facing even more budget cuts from a small federal literacy grant, I told them they could write to anyone in Washington that they wanted. He chose Laura Bush, telling me he could just tell what a good person she was. His letter was 4 pages long and filled with heartfelt pleas for keeping his school. Dear Mrs. First Lady Laura Bush, he wrote, you can't imagine what this means to me after so many years. Never in my born days did I ever think I'd get a second chance to graduate from high school. He finished his letter with a P.S. You can show this to you-know-who if you want. I think about prison and its purposes a lot. I think we have to get violent people off the streets so that the rest of us are safe, but so many of the men I knew were not violent and had not committed violent crimes. Even if they had, I saw men turn their lives completely around. Mr. Walls was open about the fact that he had committed murder as a young teenager in the south side of Chicago. When I had him in my classes, he was at the end of a very long sentence, had been a model inmate for years, and had been moved from higher level institutions into our low security. Busy preparing to go home, he knew he needed his high school diploma and was a dream student. Mr. Walls had a primary identity, and it was this. He was a tireless advocate for the abolition of capital punishment. Having done his time in prisons with people facing the death penalty, he had developed relationships with condemned inmates as he delivered books to people on death row. He would talk a lot about the people facing the death sentence, who were mostly poor and black. He was passionate and totally convinced that as a nation, we need to get rid of killing people legally. He gave talks, wrote letters to the editor, and letters to legislatures. I called it his ruling passion. Mr. Walls wrote this. I have thought a lot about this in the quarter of a century I've been locked up. When it is their loved one who is charged with a crime and convicted, People always want leniency, mercy, and humane treatment for the person they love. But when it happens to people you have no connection with, it is common to hear cries of 3 strikes and you're out, or execute him. He also wrote, "I wish citizens would demand that prisoners be treated as they would want their beloved sons and daughters to be treated, because that is who we are. We are your brothers and sisters who have lost our way and need education to find our way back." All of the men in this prison, in fact, over 90% of people in prison eventually go home. Their extremely long sentences, often for nonviolent drug-related offenses, has created not only mass incarceration, but mass disablement. I watched many men go home, excited but extremely worried about how the world had changed and how they could possibly find a job and support their families when they got out. Mr. Walls went home and wrote letters back to classes in a pre-release class, warning people just how hard it was to be out and how careful they needed to be while still on parole. The war on drugs has solved nothing about our drug use except to make us the world's biggest jailer. Prisons have not delivered safety, security, or the healing we so desperately need. Mass incarceration has cost us trillions of dollars, but the costs of locking up more people than any other country in the world are bigger than the money. I ached for the children growing up without their fathers and mothers and hearing what locking so many people away was doing to vulnerable communities. Locking this many people up has totally failed to reduce our fears of each other. In fact, it has vastly increased our fears of young black men. Brian Stevenson, who works mainly with death row inmates in Alabama, says this: "In our American system of justice today, it is far better to be rich and guilty than it is to be poor and innocent." I think it damages our national moral character. We who are free in the world also lose with this level of injustice, and the damage we inflict betrays our highest ideals of decency and freedom. When I told people of my students' charm, their humor, their tenderness and compassion, people would often respond by saying, "If he's so nice, what's he doing in there?" I want to tell a different story. Challenge the power of the fence and tell the truths that these are good and loving men, paying dearly for our policies and our fears. Once incarcerated, society lets their crimes, and only their crimes, define them. I love what Brian Stevenson also says, that we are all so much more than the worst thing we have ever done. The men also taught me that it is impossible to draw a line, put good people on one side and bad people on the other. We all make mistakes. We all behave in both positive and negative ways. I was ready to retire, but my students continue to nurture me in so many ways. And their loving kindness will stay with me for the rest of my life. My dad was an exemplary citizen, and I talked about him a lot in my civics classes. In the last months of his life, I was often flying to see him. When I came back after his funeral, current and former students were standing in a small group. When one of them called me over, they formed a tight-knit circle around me. They said, "We're so sorry about your dad, Mrs. Wenzel. We've been praying for you since we heard, and we want you to know we've got your back." Then they presented me with a large envelope. Wisely, I waited till I got home to open it. It was a huge creative card they'd made with enough space to have even former students write notes. It was filled with expressions of kindness and sympathy, and I'll pass it around so you can read this. Thankful I was home, I dissolved in tears, and it remains one of my most precious possessions. Teachers don't like to fail, and I failed with many of the men I taught. Their old damage and mental health issues way beyond my skill set. I I had all kinds of men, some so difficult they made my hair hurt. But with time and nurturing, most of them became successful students. They made me laugh, and their stories and their situations made my heart ache. They upended all of my preconceived notions about who they were and about who we are as a country. Gently, they let me know that they needed lessons that were about them, needing to forge new identities by learning about the contributions their ancestors made to this country and feel proud of who they are. In the process, we all learned together. On many days, I learned far more than they did. I learned to see my country's richness in new ways. I learned to see it whole. I learned to see them whole, imperfect as we all are, but working every day to heal the brokenness in their lives. I watched over the years as they summoned up huge amounts of courage, put their heads down, and worked so hard I had to remind them to take a break. I watched them swagger in with bravado, talk only about sports or pumping iron in the gym, and then fall head over heels in love with poetry. I watched them take exquisite care of each other in hundreds of creative ways. I watched them find their gifts and talents and the very best of who they were. I watched their fierce desire to make something better of their lives for themselves and their family. As I watched, standing on holy ground, they enlarged and sharpened my ideas of who God is. Let me say, they were the salt of the earth, every single one of them. They were among the finest people I have ever known. One more story. So I had Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore was about 6'4", very dark-skinned black man, very flaky, never had anything in on time, couldn't find his books. I forgot my notebook, somebody took my notebook. He lost his hat one very cold day in February. The prison issues everybody the same thing, so everybody got these bright neon orange knit caps. You can imagine 1,500 men. They looked rather silly. He said, "You got to help me find my hat, Mrs. Wenzel. I can't find it." So the first day we looked. The second day, he wanted me to look again. I said, "You need to go to the laundry and get another one." The third day, he broke a cardinal rule, interrupted my next class, poked his head in and said, "It's really cold out there. I don't have any hair, Mrs. Wenzel. I don't know what to do." I snapped. I pulled him out in the hall. I'm standing there looking up at him and I said, "Do I look like your mother?" He looked down, pulled back, and he said, "You know you do." So I'm happy to answer questions. I'll pass this around. There's another card in there also. They gave me when my first granddaughter was born. We have done a really terrible thing in this country. We have locked up so many people and they're invisible. And we are doing, on top of that, there are 80,000 people in solitary confinement in this country. We lock up 13-year-olds for life that don't get out. We put them in solitary confinement. They are beaten. They are sexually abused. It is out of control, and we need to wake up and do something about it. It is terrible. The thing I know most about prisons is that, like we did on Indian reservations, we put them out where nobody could see them, and now prisons are not easy places to get into. It's not like the local people can get tours. It's very, very hard to visit there or to get a tour or to see people who's in there. And when we'd see tours coming through, one of my students one day said, "I feel like an animal in a zoo. Why are they looking at us?" So nobody knows them personally, which is part of the problem. So the fence sets up this prejudice that everybody in there is a bad person. It's really awful.
Judy, can you tell people a little bit about the restorative peace movement that you know you're talking about?
Restorative justice. Yeah.
I didn't know anything about it.
So there's a small and growing movement to in 3 ways to involve the victim, the offender, and the community in a conversation so that we can come up with better ways to handle bad behavior than locking people up. Prisons are crowded. They are put in, at least in Michigan, I don't know about out here, but in Michigan they're put in small towns. Jen and I have cousins in a small town in the Upper Peninsula, and the town is mainly supported by its state prisons. So if the prisons go away, so do the jobs. So it's a kind of insidious problem. But restorative justice helps aid the victim. We don't pay any attention to victims, and they need to be cared for. We have victim-offender conferencing where the victim and the offender talk together. I heard last week that 90% of victims do not want the offender put in jail. They don't know what else there might be, but they help decide what that is. Maybe it's community service, maybe it's paying all the money back, whatever. So there's a healing in the community that is not happening now. Now there's an allegiance to the law, and who knows what those laws are. There's not a community conversation. So restorative justice programs are cropping up, and maybe that will help in the long run if it gets off the ground. So there aren't even very many books out about it. It's kind of new.
Well, if you look at South Africa, what they did, that's a good model.
Yes.
For justice with the truth and reconciliation.
Exactly.
There's a good model to look at if you want to learn more about how it works.
In Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, I would recommend highly. Also, I'm not sure if I put it on this handout, but there's a TED Talk that he gave that is fabulous. He's being called America's Nelson Mandela. And he says what we need is truth and reconciliation committees. We need to start facing our history. Brian Stevenson.
His books are in the Howard County Public Library.
I can't hear anything.
Howard County Public Library, you can get his books, Brian
Here?
Stevenson.
Okay.
He also did a TED Talk that you can listen to.
Other questions?
Where were you? Did you have these same thoughts and feelings when you started teaching in prisons?
Thank you for that question. Somebody asked me that last week. I was sort of desperate for a job. So the 2 reasons I took the job were 1, desperation, and 2, I was intrigued. But from the very first night, I knew I was in a safe place. The men were always polite and kind. Not every single one of them, but certainly enough to make a difference. And they would sort of correct each other, and you know, there were older men who put their arms around younger men and mentored them and that kind of thing.
And could you measure the progress?
We could measure maturity levels by watching them, yes. I would have men, as the program got smaller and I was teaching the classes that were required to graduate, I was teaching history and civics and English that everybody needed. I sometimes had men for 4 years, and so I'd watch them come in with 9th grade, rather immature behavior, and 4 years later stand very tall and they were grown up. They would mature right in front of me. And we also measured their academic progress, yeah. Many men would start as non-readers and graduate from high school. They'd be in the program for 6 or 7 years, working so hard. So many men were not able to read when we got them.
And what kind of literature are they allowed to have in their cells?
They had access to the interlibrary loan in Michigan, so if they wanted a book, there was a librarian in the library that could order that if they were patient enough for it to come in. So just about anything.
Could the officials block books?
I don't know. I never heard of that.
Okay.
I don't think so. Yes?
I certainly knew about the connection between drugs and alcohol in the prison population, but this number, 50% of people incarcerated in the felon detention system have not been through high school. How do we get, now that you've dealt with that population, how do we keep them out of prison by getting them through high school?
I know. And in Michigan, I live 45 minutes from Detroit, and the schools in Detroit have been failing for decades.
Do you have any insight?
I think we need to at first acknowledge that we don't give poor people and people of color the same kinds of services. I don't think we're ready to face that. I asked a group of students one time, why did you drop out of school? And one guy raised his hand and he said, because I was too cold, the windows were broken and it was January.
Do you have any statistics on how many of your students, when they graduated from high school and got out, were able to stay out?
We don't. Our program found it very difficult, and we tried everything. We gave them postcards, we said, call us. And once they got out, we could understand. They were very busy trying to put their lives back together. When they did come back, it was often for a small rule that they broke when they were in the halfway house or when they were still on paper or still on parole. It's very hard to stick with the program. Also, on my sheet, it gives a little list of what they're denied when they get out. Section 8 housing, federal assistance, student loans, all kinds of things. So we make it extremely hard for them to go home and be successful. And that came out of the Clinton administration.
So is that a federal thing or a state thing?
Federal. And I don't know how states differ from, but federal assistance is not, okay. And if your mom lives in Section 8 housing and you go home and live with your mom, if they catch you, your mom has to move. And you go back to prison. So it's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. Hard enough to go back. And the longer they stay in, the more disabled they are. I mean, you can imagine getting out and you've never used a cell phone. You've never used a computer.
Do those of you remember Melvin Russell, who was a member here, was our co-chair of our trustees for a while. He served a term in prison, and he had a terrible time getting jobs. If you remember at one point when he and Deb were coming here, he was out of work for 3 years because he was a convicted felon. And every play he would get these interviews and stuff, and then as soon as they saw the felony, I mean, part of it is also we had really high unemployment, so why would an employer take a risk on something when they have 10 other people who weren't convicted felons?
There's also, our nephew was, I think he was 21 and he had a misdemeanor. And he's 30 now. And for the first 5 years after that, when you have to fill it out on a job application, it goes in the left pile. They don't even look at it.
Right.
And he was 21. So, there is really, it's really challenging. Are there some states that are modeling better than others around this issue?
I don't know. I pay attention to what happens in my own state and what happens in my community. And since I retired in 2010, and since I've been out, there have been many, many more programs and people to support people coming out. One of the things I've picked up on is language means everything. And to call them ex-felons immediately identifies them as attached to the word felon. So the new term is returning citizen, and that helps a lot. That helps a lot. Some states have the ban the box, which means you take that question off the job application, but they sit down in an interview and there's 10 years that are missing. That person has to fill in the blanks there. It's one of the 3 years before I retired, I taught a class in educational and job opportunities, and we spent hours and hours and hours in practice interviews, and I would model. I'd say, okay, ask me, and I'd say, You're right. I want to tell you right away, I was in jail. This is what I learned. I'm a better person. I would not be the person They were terrified. Even my most confident student had a really hard time with that question. They're labeled. So once you're put in the system, you can't get rid of the label. So part of the problem is that we need to find other ways of looking at behavior that we don't like. Locking everybody up is not working. Yes?
I recently read about a program in Missouri where the University of St. Louis has gone into a prison and they do a college program. And they do it not only for the inmates but also for the guards. Because some of the guards also have not graduated.
Most of them, yeah. Yeah.
So and this brought about some jealousy when they just had the inmates.
Yeah, yeah.
So they brought the guards in, and the inmates and the guards were in the same classroom at the same time.
Wow, that is amazing.
Recent Sojourners magazine.
Ah, great.
And they've had very good success, quote unquote, so far with this program.
That's a very good point. Our program was, as I said, it was a contract program. We were not working for the federal system, and we were resented. We had to really watch ourselves and have positive relationships with federal staff because many of the people gave us a hard time. They were jealous and resentful. Yeah, and a lot of them are poor and black, and they didn't have opportunities either. So, yeah. Well,
Can you talk a little bit about the for-profit prisons?
they are very insidious. Yeah, I did a nationwide 4-day workshop for the Presbyterian Church in the 1990s and was just shocked that because they're for profit, they cut services, they make no attempt to keep that person close to his family, they cut food services, they cut everything so that the profits go up, and they lobby legislators to keep putting the crimes up so that more people can be put in jail because that's the way they make money. So it's a very nasty, insidious thing. And as I said, they often put them in places where there are no other jobs. So then you've got the community wanting to keep that prison because everybody needs jobs. So we're just fighting a private prison in Michigan right now.
I've never heard of a profit prison. What's the percentage?
I don't know. Yeah.
Western Maryland, that's the latest industry that's keeping jobs in Western Maryland.
Yeah. Really insidious.
Western Maryland, that's the latest industry keeping jobs in Western Maryland.
Private prison.
Private for profit.
Private for profit in Western Maryland?
Yes.
Okay, that's
What about
What about the one on the Eastern Shore?
I don't know the specifics, I just know it's up there. So when tire companies went out of business, they came in, provided jobs for people who had lost company in Goodyear and that same people.
And I would say that the reason that happens is the people who come up with these ideas do not know anybody personally who's in prison. If you do, it changes your perception. We're so segregated in this country. We're so profoundly segregated. So we don't have the interaction that we need. I was so lucky, I call it the privilege of proximity, to know hundreds and hundreds of people whose background was so different than mine. Just changed me. We take our privilege for granted. There's just so many things that they don't, so many legs up that they don't have. They don't have the accumulated wealth. They don't have the sophistication of how to go to college, for instance. A lot of my students, when they graduated, what are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to go to college. They had no idea what college looked like. The only people they knew graduated from college were their teachers. They didn't know anybody in downtown Detroit in their very vulnerable neighborhoods who'd gone to college. So going to college is really hard unless you have somebody take take you with them and show you how it goes and figure out the financing and that kind of thing.
I know someone who came from a very poor background and got invited to go to Stanford University and said, I can't afford it, not knowing that they would have given him a scholarship. He had no idea that there was such a thing as a scholarship.
Right.
He went to a small maybe college because he could afford that.
Right,
And
yeah.
he was accepted to Stanford, but his family was poor. No one had ever gone to college. All they could say is, well, my God, that's so much money. Nobody in their lifetime would have that kind of money.
Right, right, right. And a lot of things keep, especially black people, their names keep them, if their names are, I have a very good friend who has a daughter named Takara, which I think is just a lovely name, and she just got an MSW degree from the University of Michigan, and she's not getting any interviews, and her mom said to me, I think we have to change your name. And that's a very common thing. I've heard people say, yeah, if their names are Lakeisha or whatever, they're not going to get called. So on my sheet, 1 out of 3 people gets a call back. White people get many more callbacks. Yeah.
I'll say something to just back what you just said, and then I have a question. There's a documentary called Freakonomics that actually talks exactly what you're talking about with the names and getting hired.
Yeah.
But my question is, I as an individual, what are things that I can do to make the situation better?
Thank you. That's a great question. I knew many, many men who never had a visit, were totally alone. So I think churches could get in touch with prisons and have a letter writing communication kind of thing with inmates who are especially vulnerable. Visits are really helpful. That's one thing. Lobbying legislatures is another. There is, and I'm excited about this, there is a lot of chatter now about prison reform. I think a lot of it comes because we can't afford it any longer. But there's a lot of stuff going on. And so to be aware that things are changing and to write your legislatures is, I heard a Michigan legislator on the radio one day, and he said, if I get 3 letters about anything, I pay attention. People don't write.
Within the United Methodist Church, our United Methodist women have prison ministry is one of their major things. So if you go online to the Global Board of Ministries or the United Methodist Women's website, you'll find lots of initiatives within the Methodist Church.
Fabulous, yeah. There's been a 600% increase in the incarceration of women. 600% in the last, 5 years, something unbelievable. We didn't used to lock up women, but now we do. So you can imagine the vulnerability of their children, and men's children too. We forget about the collateral damage that we leave in the communities. Any other questions? I am very aware that it's a beautiful day. Yes?
In terms of Baltimore, a lot of the news has been focusing on Martin O'Malley when he was the mayor of Baltimore. He instituted the no tolerance laws, giving police carte blanche to go in and just arrest him for prison. Sorted out at police station labor, and 1 out of 6 men in Baltimore have police for.
Yeah, yeah. The school to prison pipeline is worth looking at. We are now expelling preschoolers, little black boys at 4 years old, calling the police on kindergartners as if that's going to solve anything. In my town, the county sheriff, which is sort of amazing, has put a full-time employee in charge of a program where grandparents mostly, but older people who are retired and have time, go into the local high school, which is pretty shaky, mostly black kids, poor kids, and the grandparents get very well trained in conflict resolution. And then if they see kids in the hall who've been kicked out of class, and I know what it's like, if you have a disruptive student, A lot of times I wanted him out of there because nobody else can learn. So that grandparent finds time to talk to that student, or if there's another student that there's been a fight with or some kind of argument, they get both of them, and as quickly as they can, they resolve the conflict and send both kids back to class. So the principal in that school said last year, "We are not expelling anyone unless they're violent and have a gun or whatever." He said, "We keep kids in school." So that has been part of the problem. When you start that young telling children that they're bad kids, why wouldn't they end up in jail? It's just, so the school to prison pipeline is really important.
I also think it's not fair to the police to use them
Yes.
that way.
Yes.
You have to all
Right.
come in to take preschoolers or whoever.
Right.
It actually puts them in more danger as this blunt force sort of weapon that we use against all these other problems that are really all of our problems.
Right.
And we want them to come in and fix it.
Right.
And I think it's really unfair to them.
I do too, yep. And so that community connection, I read one time that crime is really about broken communities. So in order to knit the community back together, there are all these ways to, even a little bit, even one little thing that you do, I think is really important. It's, it's not like you have to be a full-time 60-hour-a-week activist, writing letters, going to meetings, marching, whatever. Whatever we do is important. Even one little thing. I love that analogy of the butterfly that can change the weather, the butterfly in Brazil that can change the weather. I think that, I believe that it doesn't matter what you do as long as you keep moving and keep at it.
Does anyone here have it? I'm sorry.
I was going to say that you really did a good job teaching it as examples in what they wrote to you.
Thank you, thank you. I was very honored to know them.
And an employer couldn't say, well, you misspelled this and you forgot the X, and, they were armed to do the written work, whatever, the boss wanted correctly, so we just had to get that image out of their
Yeah.
the bosses.
Yeah. They were incredibly nurturing of me, especially as I got closer and closer to being retired. One summer, I was teaching summer school, and it was really hot. And okay, we'll let off a little bit during summer school, but I was very strict. I had very high standards, and I said, no, maybe on Friday we can see a movie or something, but today we're working. And Mr. Moore was in the first row, and he was an older man, and he said, I put an extra assignment on the board, and he raised his hand. I said, yes, sir. He said, when are you going to retire? And I said, I'm going to retire when I can no longer make you work hard, sir. And he looked at the guy next to him and he said, she ain't there yet. And it took me a while. There's that, I was a victim of what is called the soft bigotry of low expectations. They were pretty skilled at telling me they couldn't do the work because they didn't feel like they could. And they had dropped out, and so they had the labels of loser and flunky and dropout and so forth. They didn't have any skills, and so I would kind of buy into that, not make them work very hard. But the longer I was there, the harder they had to work. And it took me a while to figure that out, how to keep them accountable. I had a point system, a contract that they signed, and all kinds of things. But yeah.
What was your schedule like? Was it 5 days a week, every hour?
5 days a week. For the majority of the 25 years I was there, I worked 8 hours a day. I had men for 2 hours at a time. And that worked really well because I could work one-on-one with men in the first hour, and then pull them together for a discussion for the second hour. And one of the problems was that in a group of, say, 15 people, I would have a couple of men who were reading at 4th grade reading level, and sitting next to them were brilliant people who belonged in graduate school. So I had to tailor my lessons so that I was hitting everybody, and that took a long time for me to learn that. And our semesters were 12 weeks long, and then we often taught summer school. So 7:30 to 4 is what my hours were. So I had a bad attitude about my car to my classroom of going. I had to stand in a key line. After 9/11, things really changed. So I had to go through the security line, empty out my bag, go through the metal detector, stand in the line, get my body alarm, get my keys. That could take a long time. And I was snarky. And then as soon as I got in my classroom and closed my door, then I was fine. But the prison had a lot of, it bumped against us in a lot of ways. It was a harsh place to work. The people who were polite, though, were the inmates. The staff were, and some staff, not everybody, but there were staff that slammed doors in our faces and yelled at us, and I was terrified of them and terrified that they would find out just how many rules I was breaking. So I had to be very careful. For instance, if a man lost a family member, which happened all the time, he would come to me and say, I remember just before I retired, my sister was shot and killed yesterday. I am not going to make him sit in class. He needs to go back to his unit and curl up on his bed. So I would just do that. That was totally against the rules. And if there'd been a count, I would have been in trouble. But I just learned to just do it, and I never got caught. But that we had to kind of wiggle our way around what were basically pretty silly rules in a lot of cases. So they accommodated us. They didn't love us, the federal staff. It was a scratchy kind of relationship. And we were very isolated as a program. We weren't part of the school district, and nobody knew about us, and that was hard. So I'm writing this book called Light from the Cage, 25 Years in a Prison Classroom. So one of the things you could do for me is hit my website, because people who write books have to promote them first in order to get agents and publishers. So I'm working on that. So if you don't mind hitting my website, I would really appreciate it. Anything else? Thank you so much. It's just been delightful. I am very happy to be here. You are welcome.
Have a wonderful day.